Hi there, welcome to episode 2 of Maritime Paranormal Chat. How are you now? My name is Raven, and we are podcasting once again from beautiful Prince Edward Island on the east coast of Canada. And today, as promised, we're going to find out about some creepy dolls. And, I'm going to do a movie review on a horror movie I've seen recently. Awesome movie. It's called The Boy. Then our stories are going to take us to Nova Scotia as we visit Shag Harbor and Halifax. Then we're coming back to Prince Edward Island, and we're going to visit a small town about 5 miles outside of Surrey called New Zealand. We're going to hear a story about something interesting, fascinating, if you will, that happened there way back in 1910. We're also going to see what's new and trending in the paranormal world on the internet with our very own creepy Laroo. But first, I just want to give a shout out to Scott in Charlottetown, Ryan in Tyne Valley, Corey, Shelley, Joyce, Nicole, and Joanne, all in Summerside, Steve in Calgary, and Jason in St. John. Now, having said that, I feel like I'm on Romper Room, except I don't have a magic mirror. Do you remember Romper Room from back in the day? It had that annoying theme song that just got stuck in your head and you couldn't get it out. Well, if you've never heard that before, or if you forget how that goes, maybe this will jar your memory.
Bing bong knock knock, hey daddy do. Bing bong tick tock, bebop boom. Flip flop up up, weenie mighty moo. Boppity stoppity romper room. Hey diddle 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 dum diddy do. You be a doobie.
Okay, enough of that. I just wanted to get that annoying song stuck in your head. I'm just like that. By the way, did anybody ever figure out what a doobie is that they're singing about in that song? I mean, I highly doubt that somebody's going to be singing a kid's song for a kid's show on national TV telling them to be a joint. Anyways, everybody, thank you for listening and joining us once again. And if it's your first time listening, welcome aboard. We'd love to have you along. On the show, we examine stories of the paranormal, the unexplained, and or the just plain weird and creepy. And before we get to our stories this week, I was reading something interesting yesterday. As everybody's still in lockdown, maybe this pertains to you. Apparently, haunted house reports are on the rise during this pandemic. Now, this is according to paranormal researcher John E.L. Tenney. You may know him best as former host of TV's Ghost Stalkers. Now, he says the reason being is that more people are at home now and taking notice of their environment. The new normal is bringing out the paranormal, if you will. In a recent interview with the New York Times, Tenney says that he used to receive 2 to 5 calls a month from people who were convinced their homes or residences are haunted. But since the COVID-19 restrictions started, he says he gets 5 to 10 calls a week now. People are reporting everything from typical knocks and footsteps in the hallway to some very new strange occurrences, like people hearing whispered voices through their television sets, or getting text messages from long-dead friends and relatives. Now, Tenney believes it's because they're in a heightened emotional state during lockdown, as they're spending more time in their residences, which they normally don't do at certain hours of the day. Now, most people who normally go to work every day are not used to hearing the pops and creaks in their homes, but he says if there are genuine ghosts in your residences, perhaps you've had a ghost in your house all along, and you just never noticed before. Now, that in and of itself, I think, is really creepy. He goes on to say that if ghosts are the way we'd think about them, which is, well, they were once people, then perhaps the ghosts are getting bored too. And maybe they're making themselves a little more known to the people, and they're not commonly used to seeing these people at all hours of the day and night. Now, on the other side of the coin, maybe the ghosts don't want the extra company, which could explain why these people are experiencing more activity. Little petty things like doors opening and closing, or maybe slamming, towels falling on the floor by themselves, rattling of the shades, things like that. Maybe it's a message that they just want to be left alone in these houses and residences. Maybe they're just trying to get attention, and they're doing it the only way that they know how. Now, Tenney says the problem is, as human beings, we often have difficulty communicating and discerning the motives of other living human beings that are right in front of us. So for us to try and find out what the intention is of an ethereal, invisible being that we really can't see can be quite challenging. He does suggest, though, to take notes if these things are happening in your home. Take notes and keep journals about it, and keep track of when it happens, because apparently the majority of cases that he investigated over the past 30 years have, well, a natural explanation to them. And there might be something to that, as there could be something happening in your house, whether it be your furnace turning on, or a truck driving down the street every day at the same time that you never really noticed before. But once you start to take notes, you'll notice, he says, that it could be a repeating pattern or something that's very familiar. Now, he goes on to say that he's investigated thousands of cases, and there's probably maybe less than 100 where somebody or something really unique and strange is actually going on there. So that brings us back to this quarantine thing. It can be very stressful to people, and times of stress really do something to human psychology. And so you may see people having deeper, stranger dreams being reported, in addition to reporting a higher amount of ghosts in their houses, or even reporting full-blown haunted houses. He says he's had an increase in UFO reports as well since the quarantine started, and that could be just because people, well, they go outside and look up in the sky because they have more time to reflect. Seeing UFOs or experiencing strange phenomena doesn't mean so much that they're going crazy, but perhaps they're just becoming a little more introverted and perhaps getting to know themselves a little better. Now, Tenney also notes that you shouldn't be afraid of these occurrences if you do have ghosts, as the majority of cases he's investigated, he says people don't typically get hurt. It's more startling than scary. If someone does get hurt, it's more likely because they're startled and may fall off a ladder or run down the steps and trip on their own 2 feet. But I think that if ghosts are really here, he says they're part of an environment, part of our environment, and always have been, and we should get to know them and everything about them.
Ding dong, knock knock, hey Nanny Lou. Bing bong, tick tock, viva boom. Flip flop, up, weenie my moo. Boppity stoppity, romper room.
I just didn't want you to forget our song. So having said that, let's get down to business, because coming up, our first order of the day, how do you feel about dolls? But first, I just want to give a quick shout out to the fine folks at Money's Worth Stores in Summerside, Moncton, and Amherst. They are locally owned and operated. Come talk to their knowledgeable professional staff for all your home renovation needs. Also, Island Crafts and Candles, quality homemade products made locally in Summerside, Prince Edward Island, and Little Buddy Puzzles, locally made puzzles featuring images from local artists and photographers. And don't forget, all contact information for the above mentioned can be found on our Facebook group homepage, PEI/Maritime Paranormal Chat. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret about me. Wait now, just 1 second. I got to get my creepy voice on here. And can I get some creepy music? Creepy music, please? All right, there we go. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret about me. One thing that really creeps me out is the idea of haunted dolls. If I'm going to watch a haunted doll video, I'll have to watch it in the daytime, because if I do happen to watch one at night, which I never would, I'd have to watch about 10 comedies afterwards in order to be able to sleep. And when I say haunted doll videos, I don't mean a Chucky movie or some other horror movie like Annabelle. I mean these creepy video snippets they show on YouTube, where they have dolls that move on their own. Alleged real encounters that people have recorded moving on their own. In my opinion, outside of Barbies, I think all dolls are creepy. I'm not saying that I totally buy into the whole idea of a doll being possessed, haunted, or being able to physically take on a life of its own at will, but just the thought of a creepy looking doll moving without being touched sends shivers down my spine. Mind you, I don't suffer from pediophobia, which is the actual name for a fear of dolls, which is classified under the broader fear of humanoid figures called automatonophobia, and related to pupophobia, or fear of puppets, which is a lot more common than people think. And let's face it, the world has no shortage of haunted, possessed dolls. Among the most famous is Robert the Doll, and the famous Raggedy Ann doll that inspired the Annabelle movies, both of which apparently have to be locked up in glass casings so they don't hurt anyone further. We'll take a closer look at these in a later episode. And did you know that you can even buy dolls that are already haunted? And they don't come cheap either. On eBay, for instance, you can buy a haunted doll or sell one for up to and beyond $1,000. And they always have an abundant supply on hand. But how do you know you're actually purchasing a disembodied undead spirit trapped in porcelain and not just a regular creepy old doll? Well, the short answer is you can't. It's a leap of faith. Sellers often do sweeten the pot, though, by including descriptions or lists of unusual phenomena that surround the doll, like cold spots and audio hallucinations, communications through dreams, and ghostly orbs and pictures that surrounded the doll at the seller's house, or long detailed stories about the haunted doll's origins. But obviously, this evidence is totally unverifiable, which is why more often than not, sellers will include a disclaimer after their descriptions of the doll, saying that the haunted feature is just for entertainment purposes only. I'm not sure what the attraction is of owning a doll that can potentially kill you, but nonetheless, the demand is there. For instance, one listing on eBay warns, Haunted Doll Dakota, Spirit Child, very active. Also in the description, the seller explains the doll is embodied by the spirit of a child named Dakota, who was murdered by his mother. Even though the doll has plain, innocent-looking features, Dakota can be quite angry at times, the seller warns, and should not be treated like any other toy. He cannot be positioned near any mirrors, or he will break them. The details go on. Now, speaking of dolls that move on their own, there's actually a guy in Australia who's found and decided to keep a doll that he calls Letta, and even puts it on display for everyone to see. For a fee, of course. Why not make some money off it, right? You can actually Google this guy if you're interested. His name is Kerry Walton, and he organized a very profitable convention-style event for his 200-year-old haunted gypsy doll. And if you ever find yourself in Australia during this convention, the last one was in April of this year, it will only set you back a $5 in his terms to get a picture with it. Now, I'm not sure what the Canadian cash equivalent to an Australian $5 is, but unless that doll can sing and dance or do an awesome Elvis impression, $5 seems a little steep to me to have your picture taken with a piece of molded wood. Now, mind you, Letta looks like it's straight out of a creepy horror movie, and apparently, according to Kerry, it makes unexplained movements, even in front of people. Kerry says that he first discovered Letta underneath a haunted house in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, nearly half a century ago, and he's cared for the doll ever since. In interviews, Kerry's told the media, "I think he walks on its own in the nighttime, and ever since I found this doll, I've never heard so many strange sounds at night in my life." Now, dolls aren't supposed to move on their own, as everybody knows, so the idea that this guy's claiming a 200-year-old doll is moving objects and itself without outside assistance leads me to think this guy is either batshit crazy, he has a death wish, referring back to my earlier comment of why anybody would want a doll that could potentially kill you or somebody else, or the third option, which seems the most likely, that this guy just wants to make a quick buck. But Letta's rumored movements are child's play, no pun intended, compared to another doll that I read about this week that was allegedly hurting its owners, physically hurting its owners. No actual name was given for this doll, but it looks plain enough, as it looks to be about 18 inches tall and is wearing a wedding dress with a pearl necklace. And yes, actual pearls. Get your minds out of the gutter. The doll apparently made the news mid to last year after its owner, Debbie Merrick, and you can Google this as well, who said the doll had actually started attacking her husband, scratching him at nighttime as well as doing other things that are impossible, such as setting off fire alarms and taking off its necklace. Now, Debbie and her husband Cameron, both in their 50s, say they actually had to lock the doll in a shed after its nighttime attacks. The situation was ultimately too much for them, so they put the anger-issued doll on eBay. Now, the doll's new owner, Lee Steer, who happens to be a paranormal investigator from England, paid a whopping $1,800 American for the doll, and says he had to outbid a bunch of other interested paranormal-obsessed doll collectors to seal the deal. But Lee said shortly after getting the item that he ended up on the receiving end of the doll's hostility, waking up with scratches, which were the size of the doll's tiny hands. In addition to this, there have been many other odd and unexplained sounds. For instance, Lee said, "My dad was downstairs one morning. At this point, the doll was still packed away, and he heard like a tapping noise on wood coming from the room that the doll was in. He said his father thought it was a bit odd, as he'd never heard the sound before, and he was the only one home at the time. The sound continued as his father approached the room, and only stopped suddenly when he entered it." Now, there's actually a couple of interviews with the people who sold the doll to the paranormal investigator on YouTube, if you want to check that out. It's called "My Haunted Doll Attacked My Husband." Now, having said that, I think now would be a good time to do our movie review, which just happens to be about a seemingly haunted doll.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Get ourselves some snacks.
Now, the movie's called A Boy, and it's a 2016 horror/psychological thriller that was previously known as The Inhabitant, and the movie was actually filmed in British Columbia, Canada. Directed by William Brent Bell, who also did such movies as The Devil Inside back in 2012, Stay Alive in 2006, and Weir 2013. The Boy would be his fifth movie. It was written by Stacey Meniere, who at this point had no experience under her belt for writing screenplays. The Boy had an estimated budget of $10 million and grossed over $50.4 million in North America alone. Now, The Boy contains thrills, suspense, twists, minimal violence, frightening scenes, jump scares, and a surprise ending, which in my opinion really made the whole movie. Now, it centers around Greta, played by Lauren Cohen of Death Race 2 back in 2010, Van Wilder 2, The Rise of the Taj in 2006, and Destiny in 2014, but viewers probably would best remember her from the Walking Dead series as Glenn's girlfriend. Now, like I said, The Boy revolves around Greta, who plays the nanny, and Brahms, the boy she's hired to look after. Greta was involved in an abusive relationship in Montana and decides to leave her tragic relationship and flee to the United Kingdom for a temporary nanny job for a British family known as the Heelshires. Upon arrival, Greta is shocked to see that Brahms is nothing more than a life-size porcelain doll of a small child. What's even more shocking is that the Heelshire family treats the doll as though he's an actual living child. Apparently, the Heelshire's real son Brahms died in 1991 in a fire when he was only 8 years old. Greta was hired because the Heelshires are going on a vacation, and without Brahms, gave Greta a list of rules to follow when they're away, because Brahms is, quote, not an ordinary child, unquote, obviously. Greta agrees and follows the rules and routines at first, but soon gets tired of it, as it's just for a doll, right? A decision that she'll soon regret. Now, the creepy meter then goes up several notches as Greta starts to experience paranormal occurrences soon after she stops taking care of Brahms and starts straying from the rules. She begins hearing a child crying, and Brahms is somehow moving on his own as he starts disappearing and reappearing in different areas of the house and room. The rest of the movie was a non-stop adventure as the story unfolds. At this point, I feel it's important to mention that I'm a very big horror movie fan. I have hundreds of movies at home that are 95% horror, suspense, or thrillers. Having said that, I'm very critical about the horror movies that I watch. Now, this was a movie that I actually really enjoyed, even though a lot of reviews I've read were very negative. I'm not sure why, as I felt the casting, acting, storyline, all were well done, and for a first-time writer of a movie, I thought Stacey Meniere did an excellent job. And of course, the ending had a really nice twist as well, which is always a breath of fresh air. I'm just glad that I watched the movie before reading any reviews, because a lot of the reviews gave away the ending. I should also add that I felt the movie was well directed, as the director kept a consistent level of suspense, creepiness, and mystery right from the beginning to the very end. The Boy was a film that I was definitely looking forward to seeing, and I can honestly say that I wasn't disappointed, as it was much better than I expected it to be. I can also say I thought this movie was going to be the typical run-of-the-mill, cheesy, bad plot, stupid ending, that's an hour and a half of my life that I'll never get back type movie, but it was just the opposite. I would definitely recommend this movie, as I'm giving it a 7 to 8 out of a possible 10. And one thing I've learned over the years is that you really can't go by other people's reviews of a movie because each person has their own taste and opinions. Some of the best movies I've ever seen got really bad reviews. So I think you should give The Boy a try. It's definitely worth the watch. And now there's a Boy 2 out called Brahms. We'll save that review for another day. You were listening to Maritime Paranormal Chat. I am Raven. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we got a lot to cover, so let's go right to Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, and find out what happened there back in 1967. The first frantic callers to reach the RCMP were clear. Something had obviously crashed in the waters off Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia. It was around 11 p.m. on the night of October 4th, 1967. Most witnesses say they thought it was a doomed aircraft at first. Among the many people who saw the string of flashing lights on that clear, moonless night were 3 RCMP officers, several fishermen, and several airline pilots who were flying along the province's rugged southwest coast. Some more detailed accounts of what witnesses saw that night include the following. En route to Toronto while flying over Sherbrooke in St. Jean, Quebec from the Halifax International Airport, Air Canada Captain Pierre Charbonneau on Flight 305 pointed out to co-pilot Bob Ralphington that there was something strange in the air on the left side of the aircraft at 7:15 p.m. In his official report, the captain said an object tracking along on a parallel course a few miles away. He described it as a brilliantly lit, rectangular-shaped object with a string of smaller lights trailing behind it. At 7:19, the pilots noticed a sizable silent explosion near the large object. 2 minutes later, a second explosion occurred, which faded to a blue cloud around the object. Meanwhile, Daryl Dory, his sister Annette, and his mother were sitting on their front porch in Mahone Bay when they noticed a large object maneuvering above the southwestern horizon. The next day, Daryl wrote a letter to the RCAF Greenwood Base commander asking what was flying over the water that evening, as he'd never seen anything like it before. He got no reply. While standing at the wheelhouse of his vessel, Captain Leo Howard Mercy was looking at 4 blips on his Decca radar that were stationary. When he looked up at 28 kilometers from the vessel's window, he could see the 4 bright objects situated in a roughly rectangular formation. The entire crew of nearly 20 fishermen stood on deck and watched the object in the northeastern sky. Mercy radioed the Rescue Coordination Center and the Harbour Master in Halifax, asking for an explanation, and filed a report soon after with the Lunenburg RCMP, outlining his sighting when they arrived in port. The Chronicle Herald and local radio stations also reported a glowing object that had been seen by many people who had called their newsroom. They reported witnessing strange glowing objects flying around Halifax at 10 p.m. Ralph Lowinger, one of the pilots aboard Pan Am Flight 160, a Boeing 707 cargo aircraft that was flying at 33,000 feet that same night, said he and his crew saw the same row of flashing lights over the Gulf of Maine as they approached the coast of Nova Scotia. Now, what sets this story apart from other UFO sightings is that the impact was witnessed by several independent and very credible witnesses. At least 11 people saw the low-flying lit object head towards the harbor. Multiple witnesses reported hearing a whistling sound like a bomb, then a whoosh, and finally a loud bang. Initially, nobody reported it as a UFO, as everybody reported a plane crash, because that's what they thought it was. This gives a boost of credibility to the story. The most compelling evidence comes from eyewitnesses like Laurie Wickens, now a 67-year-old former fisherman and current president of the Shag Harbor Incident Society. Driving through Shag Harbor on Highway 3 that night, he and 4 friends spotted a large object descending into the water off the harbor. Attaining a better vantage point, he and his friends saw the object floating 250 to 300 meters offshore in the waters off Shag Harbor. Wickens contacted the RCMP detachment in Barrington Passage and reported that he'd just seen a large airplane or small airliner crash into the water. To this day, Wickens says he has no idea what it was he actually saw, but says, "All I know is that I saw something, and something definitely crashed into the water," adding that he believes the divers pulled something from the water, but nobody disclosed what it was. He says there were 4 lights in a row on the object, and they were going on and off. And he says 1 light would come on, then 2, 3, and 4, and they'd all be off for a second and come back on again. Soon after, Wickens was among a dozen or so people gathered at the water's edge, watching in amazement as a glowing orange sphere about the size of a city bus bobbed on the waves about 300 meters from shore. At 11:20 p.m., it slipped beneath the surface and disappeared without so much as a sound. Several other people called the Mounties that night, all telling the same story. Concerned for survivors, the RCMP detachment contacted the Rescue Coordination Center, or the RCC, in Halifax to advise them of the situation and asked if any aircraft were missing. Before any attempt at rescue could be made, the object had already sank and disappeared from view. A rescue mission was quickly assembled. Within half an hour of the crash, local fishing boats were already out on the crash site in the waters of the Gulf of Maine off Shag Harbor to look for survivors. No survivors, bodies, or debris were ever found, either by the fishermen or by the Canadian Coast Guard search and rescue cutter, which arrived about an hour later from nearby Clark's Harbor. By the next morning, RCC Halifax had determined that no aircraft were missing in the area. While still tasked with the search, the captain of the Canadian Coast Guard cutter received a radio message from RCC Halifax that all commercial, private, and military aircraft were accounted for along the eastern seaboard, in both Atlantic provinces and New England. That same morning, RCC Halifax also sent a priority text to the Air Desk at Air Force Headquarters in Ottawa, which handles all civilian and military UFO sightings, informing them of the crash and that all conventional explanations such as aircraft flares, weather balloons, and any other possible scenario had been dismissed. Therefore, this was labeled an official UFO report. The head of the Air Desk then sent another priority telex to the Navy headquarters concerning the UFO report and recommended an underwater search be mounted. The Navy in turn sent another priority telex tasking Fleet Diving Unit Atlantic with carrying out this request. 2 days after the incident had been observed, a detachment of Navy divers from Fleet Diving Unit Atlantic were assembled, and for the next 3 days, they combed the seafloor of the Gulf of Maine off Shag Harbor looking for the object. The final report said no trace of any object was ever found. About 36 hours after the initial sightings, several Defense Department officials signed off on a memo that made it clear authorities had no idea what they were dealing with. The memo stated a preliminary investigation has been carried out by the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax. It's been determined that this UFO sighting was not caused by a flare, float, aircraft, or any known conventional object. No attempts were ever made to explain away what people were reporting, either. Hundreds of UFO sightings are reported across Canada every year, before and since 1967, but none have had the paper trail of Shag Harbor. It's worth noting the search at Shag Harbor was conducted during a highly charged period in Canadian history. The space race was on, and so was the Cold War. Russian submarines were known to frequent the East Coast, and the Americans were testing all manner of devices to spy on their communist foes, including crude spy satellites that ejected film canisters at high altitudes. Also at that time, the area was the location for a top-secret U.S. military base which was described as an oceanographic institute. This facility used underwater microphones and magnetic detection devices to track enemy submarines, but its true purpose wouldn't be revealed until the 1980s. The Shag Harbor incident would have new life breathed into it in the early 2000s through the efforts of MUFON investigator Chris Stiles. The case intrigued him so much that he decided to search for more details. The author found the names of many of the original witnesses through newspaper clippings and was able to interview most of them. In his 2001 book called Dark Object, he eventually interviewed former military insiders and members of the Navy's Fleet Diving Unit that actually did the search. They told him the orange orb that was spotted in Shag Harbor that night had submerged under its own power and traveled to a spot on the seabed off Shelburne. Style sources also talk about a secret flotilla of American and Canadian ships that were dispatched to the area. There was speculation about Russian submarines and, yes, extraterrestrial visitors, but there's no official or hard evidence to back up these claims. During a recent search of an island off Shag Harbor, Stiles says he spotted a military marker that indicated it was placed there by staff from the fake institute in Shelburne, which means the US military had been there at some point. Stiles also was assisted by MUFON investigator Doug Ledger. These two men would uncover some extremely compelling evidence through their interviews. They discovered that when the divers finished their work, the case was far from over. The actual divers, along with other witnesses, related the following events. The object that entered the water of Shag Harbor had soon left the area, traveling underwater for about 25 miles to a place called Government Point at the mouth of Shelburne Harbor, which was near a top-secret NATO submarine detection base. The object was detected with hydrophones and naval vessels were positioned over it. After a couple of days, the military observation by Navy divers and sensors, the military made plans for a recovery operation. That's when a second USO, or unidentified submerged object, would join the first one. Off-the-record military witnesses would indicate that the second craft had arrived to render aid to the original. At this time, the Navy decided to wait and watch. After about a week of monitoring the two USOs, the flotilla of Navy vessels were promptly deployed to investigate a Russian submarine which had entered Canadian waters nearby. At this point, the two underwater craft made their move. They made their way to the Gulf of Maine, and putting distance between themselves and the chasing Navy ships, they broke the surface and shot away into the skies. These extraordinary events were corroborated by many witnesses, both civilian and military. Unfortunately, the reports were given off the record. Ex-military personnel feared the loss of their pensions, and civilian witnesses feared ridicule and their privacy being invaded. The unusual events at Shag Harbor command an important place in the study of UFOs and USOs, as we may never know what really happened that night so long ago. But there's little doubt that something unknown definitely crashed or landed in the waters of Shag Harbor on October 4th, 1967. To learn more about the UFO incident of 1967, visit the Shag Harbor UFO Incident Center, 5615 Highway 3 in Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, or give them a call, 902-723-0127.
Now here's something we hope you'll really like.
Hi, welcome once again to another episode of The Weird Report, where we examine news stories from around the world about the paranormal, the unexplained, or the just plain weird. I'm Creepy Laroo. Let's start off with some more weird animal stories like we did last time. A 5-year-old cat has taken the internet by storm thanks to his unique appearance. His name is Potato, and he seems to be stuck in a constant state of bewilderment, as his oversized eyes are like an owl, and his owner says she can't help but laugh every time she looks at him. After being adopted 2 years ago by 21-year-old Ashley Norleen, the owner snapped plenty pictures of Potato, looking puzzled in everyday scenarios. As Potato's social media presence started to climb, Ashley noticed the cat was getting more and more mentions about his unique peepers, amassing over 50,000 followers on Instagram alone. But despite so many people marveling over the cat's eyes, Ashley admits she doesn't have any idea or explanation as to why Potato looks the way that he does. She says, as soon as I got him, I started uploading pictures online, and immediately people noticed there was something different about his eyes. If you want to see a picture of this cat, just Google Potato, the big-eyed cat, or something similar to that. A goat with a human-like face was recently born in India. Images and videos have gone viral of the poor mutated animal. Initially, the goat perplexed villagers in the village of Nomodia, but it's now believed that it should be worshipped as an avatar of God. Villagers said that the goat facial structure looks like a grumpy old man. Ironically enough, So do pictures of the owner, Mukeshi Prajapat. I wonder if maybe there's more of a connection there than he cares to admit between the two. He was first to unveil his black, flat-faced goat on video, showing it wagging its tail and stumbling around. But on a more serious note, the goat likely suffers from something called a congenital defect known as cyclopia. According to the National Institute of Health, cyclopia, which occurs in humans as well as animals, is a very rare syndrome of severe facial dysmorphism. Cyclopia causes genes to defect, creating facial symmetry fail. And this isn't the first time a mutated goat was born in India. In 2017, a one-eyed black goat hit the news cycle. During that same year, a goat was born with a demonic face in San Luis, in Argentina. It had protruding eyes and a flat face. That one was stillborn. Goat imagery is often used in relation to demonic depictions, in real life and in the movies. There's also a sabbatical goat god named Baphomet. Baphomet is a deity that the Knights of the White Templar were accused of worshipping, and that was subsequently incorporated into the occult and mystical traditions. Here's another story about somebody with a haunted video. The guy who captured this footage name is Rusty Johnson from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Apparently, he had just come back from work when he discovered the creepy surveillance video footage that he set up to capture the night before. Rusty claims that he noticed some strange things happening in his house, so he decided to set up his camera. Now, things that go bump in the night are usually blamed on a freak breeze or a family pet, but this footage seems to show something far more sinister. In the video, an orange object appears to flip over and land on the floor, and also shows kitchenware and pieces of paper flying off the counters. Rusty posted the video with the comment, "I came home to find a few things out of place," and decided to view the footage. Rusty said he constantly feels like someone is looking at him when he's home. He says he could feel its presence, and sometimes it gives him chills. Shortly after, he says, "I had the most horrible feeling. I had nothing to be angry about, but I had this intense wave of anger running through me for over half an hour that I can't explain," which is kind of like me when I see what I'm getting paid for doing this segment. Anyways, back to the story. Rusty says this freaked me out and has kind of pushed me to my limit. I'm seriously considering breaking my lease and moving. I'll continue to record my apartment for evidence as long as I'm here, but if this nonsense keeps up, he says he's moving out. He also says he's lived in the apartment for almost a year, but the strange activity only started 2 months ago. Just search Rusty Johnson Haunted. He has his own channel on YouTube with several haunted videos on his channel. Very creepy indeed. Everybody falls asleep on their couch at one time or another while watching TV. It happens more often than we think. Jordan Barascus and her boyfriend Jack McKercher are no exception. Recently, after waking up after their unscheduled nap only to find that Jordan's purse had gone missing, they checked the CCTV in their front room only to find creepy footage of a burglar watching them sleeping for 10 minutes. Her boyfriend asked her, "Why are you at the top of the stairs wearing a white hoodie before we went to bed after watching the video?" Jordan replied, "I wasn't at the top of the stairs." Jordan added he stood there for about 5 minutes the first time, then walked away. Then he came back and hovered over us again for another 5 minutes. The couple are hoping that maybe he was just watching TV after robbing them, rather than watching them sleep. Search creepy video of burglar watching couple sleep if you want to see the entire video. Also, there's a picture making the rounds on the internet that is really creeping people out. It's a picture of several seemingly naked girls in a bathtub, which just happens to be in front of a window. The creepy part of the picture is that it appears there's a man standing outside looking in. He's dressed all in black and wearing a mask. I'm sure if these girls turned around, that clean bathwater would quickly change from clear to brown faster than they could imagine. There's not much information about this picture out there, but just do a search on girls in bathtub creepy picture to see it. And every now and then, a creepy internet image does the rounds and even gives me the creeps. This is one of those times. A since-deleted account recently posted a selfie online of a man and his woman, looking all smiley and carefree. But if you look closer, there's something pretty freaky in the shot. In the mirrored window behind the couple, the woman's reflection is facing the wrong way. In fact, it looks like it's a completely different person with an evil grin. Of course, it could all be just the work of Photoshop, but where's the fun in that? Let's just assume it's a demon. Search spooky selfie that appears to show a woman with two faces terrifies Twitter. And finally, there's some good news coming out of Hollywood. Dan Aykroyd is the narrator for a new series called Hotel Paranormal, a series that dramatizes the stories of people who say they were visited by ghosts or had a supernatural experience while visiting hotels and motels all over the world. He says, "I believe these people's stories, as I've seen the evidence on video." He also says he was convinced to join the show because of the compassionate way it presented the stories and the people who shared them. The trauma that these people go through in some of these incidents is quite shocking, and it stays with them. If you don't know who Dan Aykroyd is, he's likely one of the most familiar faces when it comes to dealings with the paranormal. He played Ray Stantz in the 1984 classic Ghostbusters movie, which ranks among his most loved movie characters. Aykroyd actually conceived the idea for Ghostbusters out of his own love for the supernatural, something he's been fascinated with since childhood. He says the idea from the movie came from living in a former residence that was haunted by the ghost of the late Cass Elliot. The show Celebrity Ghost Story actually has a segment on this house, featuring Beverly D'Angelo of the Vacation movies, as she actually purchased the property from Dan Aykroyd. Beyond Hotel Paranormal, Aykroyd will return to the Ghostbusters world in the upcoming sequel called Ghostbusters Afterlife, along with his fellow co-stars Bill Murray and Sigourney Weaver. Originally slated to hit theaters this July, its theatrical release has been pushed back to next March because of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the Weird Report, I'm Creepy Laroo. You're listening to Maritime Paranormal Chat. My name is Raven. Thank you very much for tuning in. We are discussing stories of the paranormal, the unexplained, and the just plain weird. Now, growing up on Prince Edward Island, there's never been any shortage of ghost stories by any means, and you never have to go very far to hear one. But one thing I've recently discovered doing this podcast through my research and gathering stories is that something big happened here back in the early 1900s, something that made national headlines. Let's find out more about it as we head down to New Zealand, Prince Edward Island. From late January to late February of 1910, people across the eastern United States and the American Midwest were thrown into a state of intense nervous excitement as newspapers published variations of an article detailing a strange case of weird and supernatural phenomena. It all surrounded a 20-year-old woman named Shanine, who lived with her brothers on a farm in the tiny Acadian settlement of New Zealand, Prince Edward Island, about 5 miles from Surrey. The following story is one such variation of that article. Please keep in mind that this article was written back in 1910. Therefore, the details may be a little sketchy at best, and any attempts I've made to verify these events through further research have been fruitless. Since the death of her parents a few years prior to these events, Shanine was keeping house for her brothers, who were small farmers in the village. Several months earlier, the eldest brother informed his sister that he intended to marry a local woman in the neighborhood. Shanine, who didn't like the girl for unknown reasons, on hearing the announcement, burst into a fit of rage and declared that she would just as soon have a devil in the family as that girl. That very night, after the members of the family had retired for the day, the household was aroused by loud and unexplainable noises, which seemed to emanate from all parts of the house. Then the voice of Shanine shrieking in agony could be heard from her room. The brother, fearing his sister was being murdered, rushed to the girl's room, followed by other members of the family. When they opened the door, they saw the young woman floating in the air several feet above her bed. She was talking incoherently, and in a language much different from that used by her in ordinary conversation. The girl finally slowly sank back down on her bed and fell into a natural deep sleep. When she woke the next morning, she knew nothing of the occurrence the night before, and her brothers were almost convinced that they themselves were suffering from delusions. But night after night, the same performance would repeat itself. Soon news of these events leaked out among the local villagers, and this simple people came to believe that the girl, by her sacrilegious remark earlier, had metaphorically sold her soul to the devil. Despite the natural reluctance and fear on the part of the neighbors, curiosity soon got the best of them, and nearly every person in the settlement visited Shanine's home to see the tormented girl. The particular phenomena continued, and most of the people in New Zealand could bear witness to the strange occurrences, for which no one could offer any explanation. The girl seemed to develop clairvoyant powers while in what seemed to be a hypnotic trance, and these powers added to the bewilderment of those who came to see her. She told her visitors how much money they had with them, and she could also tell them the addresses and contents of letters they had in their pockets. The unexplainable sounds which were present on her first demonstrations of occult powers were also present in her hypnotic trances. The noises were described as beginning with a rumbling sound, like distant thunder, increasing steadily in intensity and volume, and finally resembling the muffled blows of padded boxing gloves on a punching bag, then gradually dying away again. These demonstrations did not take place every night, but at repeated intervals, sometimes several nights in succession. To others who were more aware of cult demonstrations of trickery and hoaxes, Shanine's case only presented a study rivaling in interest in the case of Madame Palladino. Just as a side note, Madame Palladino was an Italian self-proclaimed spiritualist physical medium during that time period, who claimed to have extraordinary powers such as the ability to levitate tables, communicate with the dead through her spirit guide, John King, and to produce other supernatural phenomena. She convinced many people of her powers, but was frequently caught and exposed in deceptive trickery throughout her career. Big-name magicians at the time, including the likes of Harry Houdini and skeptics who continuously evaluated her claims, all concluded that none of her phenomena were genuine, and that she was a clever trickster. Ultimately, she was considered a fraud. Getting back to her story, several French farmers would swear in that time period to having seen the devil himself in the vicinity of New Zealand, but these visions were widely accepted as the result of overactive imaginations, mass hysteria, and alcohol use. Regarding this strange case, credence must be given, however, to the testimony of many responsible people, including a number of reputable doctors who've been consulted in regards to the young woman's condition. The local doctors were called in to treat the girl, but could do nothing. Next, the parish priest's assistance was sought, as the local residents believed the girl was truly possessed by the devil.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
And Father Walker of Rollo Bay, the local parish priest at the time, was assigned to perform the ceremony of exorcism once often resorted to by the Catholic Church for the purpose of curing one possessed of devils and demons. But even his earnest prayers and rites of exorcism were unavailing, as they had little to no effect on the girl. Even before now, the last time the clergy in the Maritime provinces have been called upon to perform this ceremony was in the case of that of a young woman in Caracat, New Brunswick, who several years ago gave evidence of similar possession. The long and solemn service was performed with great care, and in that particular case a cure was actually reported. Meanwhile, the excitement in the neighborhood became so intense that Father Walker issued a notice to his parishioners forbidding any further visits to the home of Shanine. The local townspeople ascribed a number of disasters which have occurred around the same time period without any apparent cause to the evil entity in possession of the girl. Particularly 3 fires, much like in the Esther Cox case 30 years earlier in Amherst, Nova Scotia, which destroyed neighboring barns, one of them owned by the girl's uncle, and in which a great quantity of livestock perished. Pressured to do something by the loss of property for which their sister was being blamed for by the neighbors, Shanine's brothers took more active steps to search for a cure. Therefore, several doctors were summoned from the city of Charlottetown for consultation. Among them was Dr. Peter Conroy, one of the best-known doctors in the province, and the chief of staff at the Charlottetown Hospital. Dr. Conroy declares that in Shanine's case, nothing has happened which cannot be explained by science. His personal theory was that the young woman is what he termed as an auto-hypnotic, with obsessive influences. To put it more simply, a fixed idea produces the hypnotic condition automatically within her, leaving her mind with no free will of its own. He also believed that her involuntary hypnotism created delusions in the minds of those around her. Insanity rising from jealousy of her prospective sister-in-law, which preyed on her mind, was also suggested by the doctor as a possible explanation. Others who've taken a scientific interest in the case were not satisfied with the theories of Dr. Conroy and his fellow physicians, and an investigation by people trained in psychology and the occult sciences were then welcomed. Ultimately, all efforts to relieve Shanine were unsuccessful. Her health was now steadily declining under the strain to which she's been subjected to, even in her normal moments. As nothing could be done to help her in her own home, she was eventually brought to the Falconwood Hospital for the Insane, where she was given every care and attention that medical science could command in that time, with a view, of course, to ridding her of the strange influences which have been destroying her life. Falconwood would later be replaced by a hospital called Riverside, and then by Hillsborough Hospital, which still stands on the same site to this day. The author of this article seems reluctant to accredit the possibility of a poltergeist as being responsible for Shanine's torment, a poltergeist triggered by jealousy or maybe triggered by the abuse of the young woman by her brothers. The author does, however, acknowledge that Shanine seemed to exhibit telepathy, total amnesia of the dissociative, and also levitation, which the author admits is trickier to explain. Levitation and speaking in unknown languages suggests a textbook case of possession. He also makes comments about spirits being behind it all, yet suggests Palladino-like phenomena and trickery. He also says that Father Walker wisely limited the attention the girl was getting, and Dr. Conroy seems to have been right on his suggestion of auto-hypnosis. It's interesting to note that it was a decade later that similar disturbances and fires would break out in Antigonish, about 125 miles from New Zealand, Prince Edward Island. What would eventually come to be called the Fire Spook of Caledonia Mills was investigated by Dr. Walter Prince, who came to the conclusion that Mary Ellen MacDonald, the teenaged foster daughter of a farming couple, was setting fires and causing other disturbances in a dissociative state. Mary Ellen, too, ended up in an insane asylum, at least for a time. In conclusion, as mentioned earlier, it's been very hard to find any additional information on this incident online, or any record, or even a hint of Shanine's family name. If anybody has any further information on Shanine and or her family, or this story in general, please let me know.
And now, a feature presentation.
The Five Fishermen restaurant has been a huge part of downtown Halifax's dining scene since 1975, serving up some of the finest seafood in town, with a side order of paranormal encounters. Tables can be hard to come by here, especially during oyster happy hour, or in the summer months when locals and tourists flock in for fresh mussels, or maybe for some of the delicious seafood entrees they offer. And many come because of the restaurant's reputation for having many eerie encounters, as among the many guests each year are paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and the just plain curious. The history of the Argyle Street building could explain the high frequency of paranormal activity here. The restaurant is housed in a building that was originally constructed as a schoolhouse back in 1817. Across the street is St. Paul's Anglican Church, the oldest building in Halifax, built in 1750, 1 year after Halifax was founded. Once used as an art school in the 1800s, the building was eventually bought by Snow and Company Undertaker in the early 1900s. This would be the city's very first mortuary. The company, which would go on to become J.A. Snow Funeral Home, which still operates to this day, played a critical role in two disasters over the years. The first, on April 15, 1912, was the sinking of the Titanic 640 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland. Rescue operations took place out of Halifax, which was the nearest mainland port. John Snow would board the cable repair ship Mackay Bennett, taking with him 125 coffins, embalming fluid, and iron to weigh down bodies that were to be buried at sea. The wealthier victims were brought back to the mortuary on Argyle Street, now known as the Five Fishermen Restaurant, for a more formal funeral service. The second disaster was the Halifax explosion on December 6, 1917. The windows of the Argyle Street building were shattered in the blast, but the funeral parlor remained open. Snow and Company would conduct funeral services for roughly 2,000 victims at a rate of 30 to 40 funerals per day. It's said that caskets were stacked up outside the building like cordwood, and locals say that it was after those two disasters that the stories of ghosts and hauntings in the building started. Things happen in this building, says manager Walter Fraser, who's not only heard stories, but he's also been witness to some of the strange happenings that occurred here. For example, after one busy night at the restaurant, Fraser was alone in the upstairs office. He says it was sometime after 2 a.m. and there was a sort of knocking on a repetitive basis, but out of sync, he said. He searched for it, but couldn't find the source. While most of the ghostly encounters have happened with staff, patrons have experienced the paranormal as well. One story that really amused him, he recalls, is when there was a family of 10 in from Manitoba. They didn't seem to know the history of the building. On her way downstairs from the third-floor washroom, a young girl with the group, who was about 12 years old, described seeing a young female draped in clothing and slowly drifting over the staircase. She ran to her mother, and the mother called over the waitress, who in turn brought Fraser over, as he was the manager at the time. He says, I listened to the story, and the girl described quite accurately a ghost that many others have seen over the years. We have a long history of encounters and stories here, Fraser added. Some other encounters included that of a young dishwasher. It would be his first night on the job, and his last. Late and alone, he was scrubbing and scouring pots and pans in the restaurant's dish pit. Then he heard a sound. Startled, he looked up and saw a ghost-like specter slowly drifting through the kitchen. He then bolted out of the building, never to return. He swore he saw something, says Fraser. This is why we always tell our staff, you're always welcome to stay late, but you can never stay alone. Many of the staff at the Five Fishermen restaurant are so used to odd occurrences like these that they wouldn't even bat an eye when a glass flies off a shelf with no one near, or when cutlery on a table suddenly shifts, then falls to the floor on its own accord. There's many sinks in this building, he says, and with so many sinks come many taps. Taps that like to turn themselves off and on, with no human assistance. One server related a story about being there late at night, and he was sure he was the only one left in the dining room. As he was checking the lights near the salad bar, he heard someone go through the swinging doors leading down into the kitchen. He turned quickly enough to see the doors swing shut, but on further inspection, he could find no other human presence. Another waitress tells of being there late one night. As she nears the grand stairwell that leads down to the maitre d' stand, she sees a gray apparition, a fog-like mass, slowly moving down the staircase towards her. She chose not to linger. Many staff members have described the feeling of passing through cold air pockets on the warmest of nights and days, or the sensation of what it must feel like to have a spirit move through your body. Nor is it uncommon to hear voices, especially your name being whispered, or even called out when there's no one else around. In the middle of one busy night, a server was using the credit card machine when he felt a tap on his shoulder. Trying to finish what he was doing before turning to respond, he felt a second tap. As he turned to reply, he found nobody was there. In behind the salad bar, the Five Fishermen has a private room called the Captain's Quarters, commonly referred to as the PR by the staff who worked there. One night, after all the customers had left, a waiter passed the PR and heard two people arguing, the unmistakable sound of a man and a woman. When he went to investigate the commotion, the voices had stopped. The captain's quarters was empty. On another occasion, a server, the last in the building, was locking the doors and turning out the lights. When she approached the PR, she noticed somebody entering it. Relieved that she had not locked the last remaining customer in the building for the night, she entered the captain's quarters and checked it thoroughly, but found the room empty. This was odd, considering that was the only way in and the only way out. One day in the middle of the summer, on a sunny afternoon, one employee had the task of setting up the salad bar. He would arrive at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Salad bar items were brought from the floor above on 4 large trays through the swinging doors, around the bar to the salad bar area. On one of these passes, he heard a loud crash, but because his hands were full, he could not do anything about it. Upon returning for the next load, he decided to investigate what the noise was. When he looked around the corner of the bar, he found several pieces of an ashtray on the floor. He bent down to pick the pieces up, and when he stood up, he was looking directly into a mirror. And in the mirror, he could see the reflection of an old man, slowly walking away from him down the aisle. He was tall with long gray hair, and was wearing a long black coat that looked out of place for the time period. Startled, as he was sure he was the only one in the restaurant, he returned to see who this could be, but there was nobody there. When he turned back to the mirror, the image had disappeared. Thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him, the worker just shrugged it off and returned to his duties. Several years later, the assistant manager was having a conversation with a customer on the phone at the station across from the salad bar. Again, the time was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was the only one in the dining room. At one point, he saw an elderly man standing on the landing below. "Excuse me, sir. I'll be right with you," he said. After he finished his conversation, he went to see how he could help this gentleman, but couldn't find him anywhere. He wasn't on the landing, and he wasn't in the foyer below. He checked the doors, and they were all locked, so there was no way anyone could get in or out. Later on that evening, he described this odd experience to some of his fellow co-workers, one of which was the same guy who was setting up the salad bar several years before. Was he an older gentleman with long gray hair and was wearing a long black coat that looked out of date? He asked. Apparently they had both encountered the same apparition. It was late one night as another server was resetting her section, looking forward to going home, when suddenly she heard a loud tapping coming from behind her. When she looked around, she couldn't establish where it was coming from, so she returned to her work. Again, she heard the tapping. This time she determined that it was coming from the window across the room. As the restaurant is high on the second floor, she found this to be very odd and slightly disconcerting. She went to investigate, and as she approached the window, she could see a misty gray shadow hovering outside. She hesitated, but eventually gained the courage to continue forward. By the time she reached the glass pane of the window, the image was gone. Most of these occurrences seem to happen before the restaurant opens or after it closes, when there's very few people about, but that's not always the case. This final story takes place in the middle of a busy night. As a hostess was in the process of showing a young couple to their table, she stopped at the salad bar to explain its offerings. Suddenly, she felt a harsh brush against the side of her face, but when she glanced around, she could see no cause for it. She finished sitting the couple, and upon returning to the hostess stand, the maitre d' asked, "What happened to your face?" There was a red handprint on her cheek, as if she had just been slapped violently, even though she says she didn't feel it as such. In fact, the antics that have occurred at the Five Fishermen restaurant seem to be just mischievous, maybe unable to ignore, but in the end, quite harmless. We need to remember that this was not just a funeral home at one time. This was a funeral home during two horrendous events in history, the Halifax explosion and the sinking of the Titanic. There was a lot of emotional pain and suffering experienced here. Maybe troubled spirits still linger here, wandering the halls and rooms of the building. So if you ever dine at the Five Fishermen restaurant in Halifax, Nova Scotia, you may want to think twice about ordering the soul, as you may just get several. And that concludes another episode of Maritime Paranormal Chat. Thank you very much for listening. And don't forget that if you have a personal story you want to share, or if there's a topic or famous case that you'd like to hear covered on a future episode, then please let me know. Just send me a private message on our Facebook group page, PEI/Maritime Paranormal Chat. And please keep in mind, no names will be mentioned unless you specifically say that it's okay to do so. By the way, if you hadn't guessed or known, last week's ending music was from one of my all-time favorite TV shows growing up as a kid. It was from the ending of the hilarious House of Frightenstein from the early 1970s, and that show is actually still running in syndication today. And you can also see a bunch of those on YouTube. Very entertaining, even as an adult. Here's another one for you. I'll give you a hint. The movie this is from is actually a classic horror movie from the late 1970s. Now, I'll tell you what it is next week. Until then, this is Raven signing off. Have a great week, and we'll scare you later.